Have you ever wondered who would still love you if the money disappeared overnight? Caleb Monroe was one of the richest black men in Chicago private jets. Luxury towers, millions in the bank. But after the woman he trusted chose power and status over him, he stopped believing in love. So he did something unthinkable. He dressed like a homeless man and went on blind dates to see who would still treat him like a human being. Then one woman offered him a bowl of hot soup in the freezing cold, and everything changed. Chicago looked beautiful from the top floor of Monroe Tower. Snow covered the streets below, headlights moved through the city like slow golden rivers. From up there, everything looked peaceful, powerful, perfect, and Caleb Monroe owned a large part of that view. At 38, Caleb was one of the richest black businessmen in America. His company built luxury apartments, office towers, and smart housing projects across Chicago. Magazines called him brilliant politicians, wanted his support. Investors flew across the country just to shake his hand. Everywhere Caleb went, people smiled, but smiles were not love. Every night he came back to the same penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. Expensive art covered the walls. Soft music played from hidden speakers. A private chef prepared dinner. Still, the place felt empty. Too empty, his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Board members, reporters, investors. 3 missed calls from his mother. Caleb ignored them all. "Mr. Monroe." It was Maya Brooks, his assistant, speaking through the intercom. "You still have the downtown meeting tomorrow, at 8. "Cancel it." A short pause. "You've canceled twice already." "I know. Are you okay?" Caleb looked at his reflection in the window. "I'm well dressed, tired." Maya said nothing for a second, then softly, "I'll handle it." The call ended. Caleb walked to the dining table. 2 wine glasses sat there from the night before. One was untouched. His eyes stopped on the empty chair. Natalie. Everything always returned to Natalie. Brooks, she was beautiful blonde, elegant, always perfectly dressed. She knew how to speak at charity dinners. She knew how to smile for cameras. She knew how to make powerful people feel important. For 2 years, Caleb believed she loved him. Not Monroe Tower, not the cars, not the money him. 6 months earlier, he proposed beside Lake Michigan. During the first snowfall, no cameras, no reporters, just wind, cold air, and waves hitting the rocks. Natalie cried when she said yes. Now Caleb wondered if those tears had been real. The truth came 3 months later. Caleb returned early from a business dinner downtown. He bought flowers from Natalie's favorite shop near Gold Coast and went to her condo. He still remembered the warmth in his chest as he stepped out of the elevator. Then he heard laughter, a man's voice. Then, Natalie's. "Caleb trusts me," she said softly. The man laughed. "Daniel Whitmore, young political star. Future mayor candidate, wealthy family, perfect public image. That's because Caleb still believes people are honest," Daniel said. Caleb stopped near the hallway. His hand tightened around the flowers. Daniel spoke again. "Marrying Monroe would have secured your future." Natalie gave a small laugh. "Caleb is good, but you have real political power, Daniel. Power lasts longer than buildings." Something inside. Caleb broke quietly, deeply, not enough to make him shout, just enough to change him forever. Natalie finally saw him. Her face went pale. Daniel stood quickly. "Mr. Monroe, this isn't Caleb," raised one hand. Daniel stopped. The room went still. Caleb walked to the glass coffee table and placed the flowers beside Natalie's wine glass. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small velvet ring box. Natalie's voice shook. "Please let me explain." Caleb looked at her. "You already did." He placed the ring beside the flowers. Then he walked out. No yelling, no threats, no broken glass, just silence. And that silence followed him home. After that night, women still smiled at Caleb. Influencers, still tried to sit beside him at events. Models still laughed at his jokes. Wealthy families still introduced him to their daughters. But Caleb started noticing things. The fake laughter, the careful compliments, the way people changed when they heard his last name. Nobody asked if he slept well. Nobody asked if he was lonely. They only saw the billionaire. One freezing night, Caleb drove alone through South Side Chicago, the neighborhood where he grew up. At a red light near an old bus station, he saw a homeless man pushing a shopping cart through the snow. People walked around him. Cars passed him. No one looked twice. He was invisible. Caleb stared through the windshield. Then one painful thought entered his mind. If I looked like him, would anyone still see me? His hands tightened on the steering wheel. Another question followed. If I were poor, who would actually choose me? That question stayed with him all night. And before sunrise, Caleb Monroe made a quiet decision. He was going to find out. Caleb Monroe did not make the decision overnight. For 3 days, he kept asking himself the same question. Was he being foolish or finally honest with himself for the first time in years? On the 4th morning, he called Maya into his office. She walked in carrying a tablet and a stack of contracts, but stopped when she saw the old backpack sitting on Caleb's desk. "What's that?" she asked carefully. Caleb leaned back in his chair. "I need you to help me disappear for a while." Maya frowned. Disappear? No company events, no interviews, no drivers, no penthouse. She stared at him in confusion. "Caleb, what are you talking about?" He stood and walked toward the window, overlooking downtown Chicago. "I want to know how people treat a man who has nothing." Maya slowly lowered the tablet. "You're serious, very." A long silence filled the office, finally. She sighed. "This is because of Natalie." Caleb looked down briefly. "This is because I don't know if anyone has ever actually seen me." 2 days later, Caleb Monroe vanished from his normal life publicly. Maya told people he was taking time away after stress-related exhaustion. The media accepted it quickly. Rich men disappeared all the time. But privately, Caleb began creating a completely different life. He rented a tiny room in South Side Chicago, under a fake name. Cal Carter. The building was old and tired. Cracked walls, weak heat flickering hallway lights. The mattress felt thin enough to touch the metal springs underneath the bathroom sink, leaked constantly. For the first time in almost 15 years, Caleb lived somewhere without security guards downstairs. No marble floors, no private elevators, no silence, filled with luxury, just noise. Sirens outside, neighbors arguing through thin walls. Music playing somewhere at midnight. Caleb sat on the edge of the small bed that first night and stared around the room. The place smelled faintly like dust and old cigarettes. He almost laughed. 1 month earlier, he had slept on imported Italian sheets that cost more than most people's rent. Now he was sitting in a room smaller than his penthouse closet. Yet strangely, the room felt more honest. The next morning, Caleb shaved his beard unevenly. On purpose, he stopped wearing tailored suits. Expensive watches disappeared, designer shoes disappeared. He bought faded hoodies, old jeans, work boots, and cheap jackets from thrift stores. Then came the hardest part, the dating profile. Caleb sat in the small room with his phone in his hand for nearly an hour before typing anything. Name Cal Carter, age 38. Job warehouse worker and handyman. Living situation. Starting over after financial problems. Looking for something real, he uploaded simple photos taken by Maya near train stations and coffee shops. No luxury, no signs of wealth, just a tired-looking man with kind eyes and worn clothes. Caleb stared at the screen after posting the profile. It felt ridiculous, embarrassing even. Yet deep down, he could not stop himself anymore. He needed the answer. The first few days shocked him more than he expected. Nobody looked at him the same way anymore. At a downtown coffee shop, the cashier barely glanced at him before saying impatiently, "You ordering or not?" At a grocery store, security followed him through 3 aisles. Because of his clothes, one woman pulled her purse closer when he stepped into the elevator beside her. Caleb noticed everything now. The avoidance, the discomfort, the invisible wall. People created around poor-looking men before people opened doors for him. Now they avoided eye contact completely. One afternoon, Caleb picked up temporary work. Unloading delivery trucks near West Loop, the supervisor. A heavy-set man named Rick tossed him gloves without even asking his name. Trucks late move faster if you want full pay. Caleb spent 6 hours lifting heavy boxes in freezing wind by the end. His back ached and his hands burned despite the gloves. When payday came, Rick handed him wrinkled cash without looking up from his clipboard. Be back tomorrow if you need work. Need work. Caleb stared at the small stack of bills in his hand, while workers around him hurried toward buses and trains. Nobody cared who he was. Nobody admired him. Nobody smiled too hard. For the first time in years, Caleb Monroe understood what invisibility felt like, and honestly, it hurt more than betrayal. That night, he stopped at a small diner near Southside. A waitress walked over with tired eyes and handed him water. You buying food or just warming up? Caleb blinked slightly. Food, her expression softened a little. Okay. Sorry. Long night, Caleb nodded quietly. That moment stayed with him, because for the first time, someone's kindness depended on whether he could afford a meal. He looked around the diner. Construction workers, tired mothers, bus drivers, nobody there. Cared about status. They were simply trying to survive another day. Caleb suddenly remembered something his late grandfather once told him as a child. Money changes how the world hears your voice back then. Caleb did not understand those words, now he did completely. Every night in that tiny apartment, Caleb wrote observations in a notebook. How people reacted to poor clothing, how quickly respect disappeared, how differently the world treated struggle when it became visible. But one thought kept returning stronger each day. If strangers treated him differently this fast, what would happen when women believed he truly had nothing? That question followed him into sleep every night. And soon, Caleb Monroe was finally ready to begin the dangerous experiment that would completely change his life. The first match was named Vanessa Reed, 29 years old. Lifestyle influencer, nearly 200,000 followers on Instagram. Her profile was filled with rooftop parties, designer handbags, and captions about protecting your peace. Caleb almost laughed when she agreed to meet him. They chose a small coffee shop near West Loop. Caleb arrived early, wearing faded jeans, work boots, and a dark hoodie with a worn jacket over it. He looked exactly like a tired warehouse worker trying to survive another Chicago winter. Vanessa walked in 20 minutes late wearing high heels and a cream-colored coat that probably cost more than most people's rent. She looked around the cafe once before spotting Caleb near the corner table. Her smile disappeared. Immediately, she walked over slowly. You're Cal. Yeah, Caleb answered calmly. Vanessa sat down carefully, like she was afraid the chair might stain her clothes. She glanced at his boots first, then his jacket, then his hands. So she said awkwardly, You really work at a warehouse, mostly loading trucks? Silence. A waitress came over. Vanessa ordered only bottled water. Caleb ordered coffee. Vanessa checked her phone while he spoke. She barely looked at him. You live alone? She finally asked. Tomb rental in Southside. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. Southside, Caleb nodded. Vanessa forced a polite smile. Wow, that must be different. Caleb already understood what she meant, more dangerous beneath her. He decided to push a little further. I'm trying to save money right now. Things got hard. After some debt problems. Vanessa leaned back immediately. Her energy changed completely. The warmth disappeared from her face in seconds. Another silence. Then she looked directly at him. For the first time all night. Can I be honest? Caleb nodded. I just worked too hard in my 20s to date struggle. Caleb almost smiled at the sentence because of how rehearsed it sounded like she had said it. Before Vanessa stood before finishing her water. You seem nice, Cal. But I think we want different things. Then she left. Just like that. Caleb sat there alone, staring at the untouched coffee between his hands. The waitress came over carefully. You okay? Caleb gave a small nod. Yeah, but honestly, he was not. Not because Vanessa rejected him. Rejection never scared him. What hurt was how quickly she decided his value after hearing one word debt, as if struggle itself made someone unworthy of kindness. The second date happened 4 days later. Her name was Rebecca Collins, 35, corporate lawyer. Sharp eyes, sharp voice, sharp everything. They met at a small restaurant downtown. Rebecca arrived exactly on time, carrying a leather folder under one arm. Caleb noticed that immediately, a folder like she was arriving for a job interview instead of a date. Cal, she asked. That's me. She sat down and crossed her legs neatly. I appreciate punctuality, she said. Most men waste time. Caleb smiled slightly. I try not to. At first, the conversation felt normal enough. Rebecca asked about his work schedule, his apartment, his family. But after 10 minutes, Caleb realized something strange. She was not listening emotionally. She was evaluating him financially. Any savings, she asked casually while opening the menu. Caleb blinked once. Not much retirement plan, no. Rebecca nodded slowly, like a banker reviewing a loan application. What about health care? Caleb almost laughed out. Great. She closed the menu. Can I be direct? Sure, you seem responsible. But statistically speaking, relationships fail under financial instability. Caleb stared at her quietly. Rebecca continued speaking calmly, almost academically, v matters. Obviously, but long-term compatibility requires structure, security, upward mobility. Upward mobility. Caleb knew exactly what she meant: money, status, potential. She wanted a future investment, not a partner. When dinner arrived, Rebecca barely touched her food. 10 minutes later, she checked her watch. I should go, Caleb nodded politely. Of course. She stood and gave him a sympathetic smile. You're a good man, Cal. But honestly, right now, you're surviving. I'm looking for someone established. Then she walked away. Caleb sat there, long after she left. The food suddenly tasted cold. By the third date, he told himself not to expect anything anymore. Her name was Tiana Brooks. 27, nursing student. Soft voice, warm smile. She laughed easily and listened carefully when Caleb spoke. For the first time since starting this experiment, Caleb relaxed a little. They walked through Millennium Park, holding hot chocolate, while snow fell around them. Tiana shared stories about growing up poor. With her mother, Caleb talked about long work shifts and trying to rebuild his life. She touched his arm gently while listening. You have kind eyes, she told him quietly. Caleb felt something dangerous move inside his chest. Hope. Real hope. Maybe Maya was right. Maybe good people still existed that night. Caleb went back to his small apartment, smiling for the first time in weeks. Then the text arrived the next morning. I'm really embarrassed to ask this. My rent is short and my electricity might get cut off. Could you help me with even a little money? Caleb stared at the message for a very long time. His chest slowly tightened. Not anger, not even disappointment anymore. Just exhaustion. He placed the phone face down on the table and sat quietly in the dark room. By then, Caleb Monroe finally understood something painful about the world. Most people did not care who you were. They cared about what you could provide. Money, security, status, comfort, value. And the more invisible he became, the more brutally honest people became too. But deep down, one small part of Caleb still refused to completely give up hope, and that tiny remain in hope would soon lead him somewhere far colder and far more painful than he ever imagined. After the third date, Caleb stopped checking the dating app for almost a week. He still went to work, still loaded trucks, still came home to the tiny apartment in Southside. But something inside him had changed. The disappointment no longer felt sharp. It felt heavy, quiet, like carrying wet concrete inside his chest. One freezing evening, Caleb sat alone on the edge of his bed, staring at his phone, while snow tapped softly against the window. Then he finally called Maya. "I think I did this wrong," he said quietly. Maya's voice softened immediately. "What do you mean?" Caleb rubbed his face slowly. "Even pretending to be poor, I still had somewhere warm to sleep. I still knew I could walk away any time." Maya stayed silent. Caleb looked down at the floor. "I haven't really felt what hopelessness looks like yet, Caleb. I need to go deeper." Maya already knew she would not change his mind. 2 days later, Caleb packed only a backpack and left the apartment behind temporarily. This time he stopped pretending to be a struggling worker. He became homeless. Real homeless. He stopped shaving completely. His clothes became dirtier. He wore 2 oversized hoodies under an old winter coat with torn sleeves. He carried a small sleeping bag and sat near bus stops, church steps, and train stations downtown. The first morning nearly broke him. Chicago winter did not care about pride. Wind cut through every layer of clothing like knives. Caleb sat near a bus station, holding a cardboard cup, while people rushed past him pretending not to notice he existed. A man in a business suit dropped $2 into the cup without looking at Caleb's face once. A teenage boy laughed while recording him on his phone. "Yo, this dude looks frozen." His friend zoomed in closer with the camera. "Bro probably smells crazy." They walked away laughing. Caleb sat perfectly still. 20 feet away stood a giant digital billboard displaying an advertisement for Monroe Enterprises, his own company, his own face smiling confidently above the city. Caleb looked up at it for a long time. Nobody around him recognized him anymore. Not one person. That realization hurt more than he expected. Around noon, an older woman stopped beside him outside a church. She handed him a paper bag, carefully turkey sandwich. She said softly. Caleb looked up. "Thank you." She smiled gently. "Stay warm, honey." Then she kept walking. Caleb stared at the sandwich in his hands for several seconds before opening it slowly. It was the kindest interaction he had experienced all week. Not because of the food, because she looked him in the eyes while speaking, like he still mattered. But moments like that were rare. Most people treated him like part of the sidewalk, invisible, when convenient, dangerous when noticed. One afternoon, near downtown Chicago, Caleb sat beside a closed convenience store, trying to warm his hands, when 3 young women approached holding phones. One of them wore expensive makeup and a white designer jacket despite the cold. "Oh my God," she whispered dramatically while filming guys. "This is heartbreaking." Caleb instantly understood what was happening. Content the woman crouched beside him with perfect camera angles already prepared. "I, sir," she said loudly. "For the video, we just want to bless you today." Her friend continued recording. Caleb said nothing. The influencer reached into a shopping bag and handed him a fast food burger, while smiling brightly at the camera. "Remember, everyone? Kindness matters." Then she leaned closer and whispered under her breath, "Can you look sadder for the thumbnail?" Caleb slowly looked at her for 1 second. Genuine embarrassment flashed across her face. Then it disappeared instantly. "Thank you so much, guys," her friend said while ending the recording. 30 seconds later, they walked away, laughing near the corner. Caleb sat there, holding the cold burger in silence. He suddenly understood something ugly about modern loneliness. Sometimes people helped others not because they cared, but because suffering made good entertainment online. That realization stayed inside him all night. Later that week, snow began falling harder across Chicago shelters. Became overcrowded, Caleb spent one evening sitting outside a church near South Loop, watching people line up for warm meals. A volunteer came outside holding blankets. "Sorry," she said apologetically. "We're full tonight." Caleb nodded quietly. It's okay, it was not okay. For the first time since starting this experiment, real fear entered his chest. The kind homeless people lived with everyday fear of freezing, fear of disappearing, fear of becoming invisible forever. That night, Caleb sat beneath a bus shelter, unable to sleep, while cold wind pushed through the broken glass beside him. Cars rushed past endlessly. Nobody stopped. Nobody looked twice. He thought about the women from the dates Vanessa, Rebecca. Tiana, then he thought about himself before all this expensive suits. Private elevators, charity galas, speeches about community investment. Caleb suddenly felt ashamed because before this experiment, even he had never truly seen homeless people either. He donated money, signed checks, funded shelters, but he had never sat beside loneliness itself before. Around 2 a.m, Caleb whispered something quietly into the freezing dark. How many people feel like this? Every day his voice almost cracked saying it. The city kept moving around him anyway. Loud, cold, indifferent, and just when Caleb Monroe finally began losing hope in people completely fate, quietly prepared the one encounter that would change his life forever. That Thursday night was colder than usual. Wind pushed through downtown Chicago so hard, it felt like the city itself was angry. Caleb sat near a bus stop across from an old church on South Side, with his hood pulled low and his hands hidden under his sleeves trying to stay warm. Snow covered the sidewalk in gray slush. People hurried past him without slowing down. Some avoided eye contact completely. Others looked at him the same way people looked at broken street signs. Something ugly, but ordinary. Caleb barely reacted anymore. After weeks of rejection, humiliation, and silence, his heart had started going numb. Then he heard a woman's voice. "Sir, you shouldn't be sitting out here like this." Caleb looked up slowly. A woman stood in front of him, holding 2 grocery bags and a paper cup tray. She looked around, 32 white woman, auburn curls tucked under a knitted hat, simple brown coat. No makeup except tired eyes. From a long day, she did not look rich, she looked real. Caleb gave the same answer he always gave strangers, "I'm okay." The woman frowned slightly. "Your hands are purple." Caleb glanced down. She was right. Without another word, she placed one of the paper cups beside him. Warm steam floated into the cold air. "Hot soup," she said softly. "Careful, it's still hot." Caleb stared at the cup. "Don't have to do that." "I know," she smiled gently. "That's usually when kindness matters most." Something about the way she said it felt honest. No performance, no pity. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a pair of dark wool gloves. "Take these too." Caleb blinked. "What about you?" "I have another pair at home." Hesitated before accepting them slowly. The gloves were warm from her hands. "Thank you." "You're welcome." Most people who helped homeless people left immediately afterward. Quick charity. Quick guilt. Relief, but this woman sat beside him on the bench, like nothing about him scared her. Caleb looked at her carefully. "You're not worried?" "Sitting next to me." She gave a small shrug. "Should I?" "I be most people are." The woman watched cars pass through the snow for a moment before answering. People think protecting themselves means shutting everyone out. Then she looked at him. But careful doesn't have to mean cruel. Caleb felt those words land somewhere deep inside him. He had spent weeks being treated like less than human, yet this stranger spoke to him with more dignity than most wealthy people ever had. She held out her hand. "I'm Grace." Caleb shook it gently. "Cal." "Nice to meet you, Cal." Her hands felt freezing, too. That surprised him. She was struggling herself. He could tell now. The old boots, the worn coat sleeves, the exhaustion in her eyes. Grace opened one grocery bag and handed him half a sandwich wrapped in napkins. "Eat." Caleb almost smiled. "You were supposed to eat this." "I'll survive. That's what everybody out here says." Grace laughed quietly at that. A soft laugh, real. Caleb realized he had not heard a real laugh directed at him. In weeks, they sat together while buses came and went through the storm. Eventually, Caleb asked, "What do you do? Community center work?" "Mostly youth programs. After-school tutoring. Whatever. Pays enough to keep the lights on." "Sounds exhausting, it is." She smiled again, anyway. "But some kids need people to stay." Caleb studied her face carefully. Grace did not carry bitterness. The way many people did, she looked like someone. Life had disappointed many times, but she refused to become hard because of it. That fascinated him. "And you?" she asked. Gently, Caleb looked down at the soup in his hands. "Trying to survive right now." Grace nodded without judgment. No suspicious look, no financial questions, no fake sympathy. Just acceptance. That almost broke him more than cruelty. Ever did, snow kept falling harder around them. Grace stood and adjusted her scarf. "The church opens overnight shelter beds after 8. She said, "You should go inside tonight." Caleb nodded slowly. Maybe she looked at him for a second longer. "You know something strange. What you don't look defeated." Caleb quickly looked away. That sentence hit too close to the truth. Grace smiled softly. "You look like somebody who's tired of carrying pain alone." Caleb felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. Nobody had looked at him that carefully in years. Not Natalie, not investors, not board members, not even himself. Grace picked up her grocery bags. "Stay warm." "Cal," she started walking away through the snow. Then Caleb suddenly spoke again. "Grace." She turned back. Yeah, he held up the gloves slightly. "Thank you for talking to me like I'm normal." Grace's expression softened immediately. "You are normal." Then she disappeared into the snowy Chicago night, while Caleb sat frozen on the bench, holding warm soup between his hands. And for the first time since this painful journey began, Caleb Monroe no longer felt invisible. What he did not know yet was that the woman who gave him soup and gloves on the coldest night of winter was quietly about to change his entire life. After that night at the bus stop, Grace started looking for Caleb. Almost every evening, she brought soup, sometimes coffee, sometimes nothing except conversation. Strangely, that became Caleb's favorite part. Not the food, not the gloves. Just being spoken to, like he still mattered a week later. Grace convinced him to help at the community center where she worked weekends. "You're strong," she told him, while handing him a box of canned food. "Might as well put those warehouse muscles to use." Caleb laughed softly. That obvious, earth. The community center sat inside an old church basement near South Side. Folding tables, warm lights. Children running everywhere. Elderly people lined up for meals, while volunteers carried trays back and forth through the crowded room. Caleb spent the afternoon serving soup. Beside Grace, nobody there cared about status. Nobody cared about titles. People only cared whether you showed up or not. An older man near the back smiled at Caleb. While taking a tray, "Appreciate you, brother, Caleb." Nodded quietly. That simple sentence stayed with him all day. Grace noticed he worked harder than everyone else, carrying heavy boxes. cleaning tables, taking trash outside without being asked around closing time. She handed him a bottle of water. "You know," she said, "you don't act like somebody who gave up on life." Caleb leaned against the counter carefully. "Maybe I'm still deciding." Grace smiled faintly for answer. Over the next few weeks, they slowly became part of each other's routine. Caleb helped at the center almost every day. Now he walked Grace home some evenings. After late shifts, they shared cheap coffee from gas stations when money felt tight. And somehow, without either of them noticing exactly when it happened, loneliness started disappearing. Little by little. One snowy night, Grace invited Caleb into her apartment for the first time. It was small. Tiny kitchen old heater, clicking loudly near the wall. Books stacked everywhere. Family photos on shelves. Nothing expensive. But the place felt warm in a way Caleb's penthouse never had. Grace cooked grilled cheese sandwiches, while Caleb sat at the counter watching her move around the kitchen. What she asked with a laugh, Caleb shook his head slightly. But it was not nothing. He was realizing how dangerous this was becoming. Because for the first time since Natalie betrayed him, Caleb genuinely cared about someone again. Grace placed a plate in front of him. "Don't judge my cooking." Caleb took one bite too late. "It's good." She smiled proudly. Then slowly her expression softened. "Can I tell you something, of course?" Grace sat across from him quietly. "My dad left when I was 11. Mom worked 3 jobs after that. She looked down at her tea some nights. We pretended not to be hungry so the other person would eat more." Caleb listened silently. "That's why I hate when people look down on poor people," she continued softly. "Most people are one disaster away from struggling." Caleb felt guilt rise slowly inside his chest, because unlike Grace, he could escape this life anytime he wanted. She noticed him getting quiet. "You okay?" Caleb forced a small nod. "Yeah," but he was not okay. Every moment with Grace made the lie heavier. He started hating himself whenever she smiled at him sincerely, because she believed he was truly this man. Cal Carter broke lost invisible. One evening after volunteering, Caleb stood outside the church, staring at downtown Chicago glowing in the distance. His real world waited there. The towers, the money, the power. Grace walked beside him, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You disappear into your head a lot," she said softly. Caleb accepted the coffee. "Sorry. You've been hurt badly before, haven't you?" Caleb looked at her carefully. Grace continued quietly. "You carry trust issues like armor." That sentence hit him hard, because it was true. He gave a tired smile. Maybe Grace stepped closer, snow crunching softly beneath her boots. "Whoever hurt you before, don't let them turn you cold." Caleb looked into her eyes. Then real eyes. Honest eyes. Not calculating. Not pretending. And suddenly, he wanted to tell her everything, his real name, his company, his entire life. But fear stopped him. Fear that once she knew the truth, this beautiful, simple connection would disappear too. A few days later, Grace approached him nervously while cleaning tables at the community center. "Hey, there's something I wanted to ask, okay?" She brushed hair behind her ear. "Awkwardly, our center is hosting a charity gala downtown next week. Fancy donors, speeches, rich people pretending they care." Caleb laughed quietly. "Sounds painful already." Grace smiled. "Maybe, but they need volunteers there too." She hesitated briefly. "Would you maybe come with me?" Caleb paused for half a second. A gala downtown, wealthy people, cameras. Dangerous territory. Grace quickly looked embarrassed. "Forget it." "It was stupid, no," Caleb said immediately. "I'll go." Grace smiled softly at him. Then, and Caleb's heart sank at the same time it lifted, because he already knew something. She did not. The world she was inviting him into was actually his. And very soon, both of their lives were about to collide in ways neither of them could imagine. The charity gala was held at the Harrington Hotel. Downtown, the kind of place where even the lobby smelled expensive, crystal lights hung above polished floors. Men in tailored suits laughed beside women in silk dresses. Cameras flashed near the entrance. Donors smiled for photos. Before they even wrote a check, Grace stood outside the ballroom for a moment, smoothing the front of her navy dress. It was simple. Pretty, borrowed from a friend. Caleb stood beside her in an old gray suit he had bought from a thrift store 2 days earlier. The sleeves were a little short, the shoulders did not fit right. But he stood calm, steady, and quiet. Grace looked at him nervously. "You sure you're okay?" Caleb gave her a small smile. "I'm here with you." That was enough for her. They walked in together. At first, nobody said anything directly, but Caleb noticed the looks. Immediately, a woman glanced at his shoes, then whispered to her husband. A man near the bar looked Caleb up and down, like he was trying to find the mistake in the room. Grace noticed, too. Her fingers tightened around her small purse. "Ignore them," she whispered. Caleb smiled faintly. "I've had practice." They moved toward the community center table where a few volunteers were setting up donation cards. Grace introduced Caleb as Cal. Most people nodded politely, but their eyes moved away quickly then. Daniel Whitmore stepped onto the small stage. Caleb's body went still. Daniel looked exactly the same as the night Natalie betrayed him, clean. Suit, easy smile, perfect voice. He spoke about compassion, housing, and helping families in need. The crowd clapped warmly. Caleb listened in silence. Every word sounded polished. Every sentence sounded empty. When Daniel stepped down from the stage, he spotted Grace and walked over with a politician's smile. "Grace Turner," he said, still fighting the good fight. Grace's smile was tight. "Someone has to," Daniel chuckled, then turned to Caleb and, "This is Cal," Caleb said calmly. Daniel offered his hand, but his eyes had already judged the suit. The shoes, the tired face. "Good to meet you, Cal. Are you with one of the sponsor groups?" "A volunteer, something like that." Daniel's smile widened. "Just a little. Something like that." Interesting answer. A few people nearby listened. Daniel tilted his head. "What do you do for work?" Caleb held his gaze. "Whatever work I can get someone behind." Daniel gave a quiet laugh. Grace's face changed. "He works harder than most people in this room." Daniel lifted both hands. "I'm sure he does. No offense. Meant." But offense was exactly what he meant then. Another voice came from behind them. Hey, Caleb turned slightly. Vanessa Reed stood near the bar, phone in hand, wearing a bright silver dress and a shocked smile. "Oh my God, I know him." Grace looked confused. "You do?" Vanessa laughed already, enjoying the attention. "He's the homeless guy from my video." The nearby conversations began to fade. Heads turned. Caleb stayed silent. Vanessa stepped closer. "I gave him food outside a store a few weeks ago. It got like 80,000 views." Grace looked at Caleb, startled. "Cal," Vanessa kept going. "I'm not trying to be rude, but why is he here? Is this part of some awareness campaign?" Daniel's smile became colder. "Grace, did you bring a homeless man to a donor gala?" Grace straightened. "I brought a man who has more dignity than most people here." The room went quiet enough to hear glasses clink from the bar. Daniel leaned closer. Voice low, but sharpless. "This event funds your center. Be careful how you behave." Grace's eyes burned. "Daniel, you be careful. You stand on stages talking about poor people like they are props. Then you panic when one walks into the room. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Vanessa rolled her eyes. "Okay, this is getting dramatic." Caleb finally spoke, calm, low. "Grace, we can leave." But Grace shook her head. "You didn't do anything wrong. At that moment, a hotel security manager approached with 2 guards. His expression was polite, but hard, sir. He said to Caleb, "We've had some concerns from guests." Caleb looked at him. "Concerns? We need to ask you to step outside." Grace stepped in front of Caleb. "He's with me." The manager lowered his voice. "Ma'am, please don't make this difficult." "Difficult?" Grace repeated. "You mean embarrassing for you." Daniel placed a hand on his chest like a disappointed leader. "Grace, nobody is attacking him. But this is a private event." Caleb touched Grace's arm gently. It's okay, no," she whispered. "It's not." The guards waited. Guests watched. Phones came out. Vanessa began recording again. Caleb saw the old pattern. Immediately, pain becoming entertainment, poverty becoming content. A black man in a cheap suit being treated like a threat in a room built for charity. His jaw tightened, but he did not raise his voice. He turned toward the door. Grace grabbed her coat and followed him without hesitation. "If he leaves," she said clearly, "I leave too." They walked across the ballroom, while whispers followed them. Like cold wind, Caleb felt every stare. But Grace kept walking beside him, head high, hand close to his outside. The night air hit them hard. Grace's eyes shone with anger and hurt. "I'm sorry," she said. Caleb looked at her softly. "You didn't humiliate me." Before he could say more, headlights swept across the hotel entrance. One black SUV pulled up. Then another, then a third. The doorman froze. Guests near the windows turned. The first door opened, and Maya Brooks stepped out in a black coat, calm and composed. She walked straight toward Caleb, ignoring everyone else. Grace stared in confusion. Maya stopped in front of him and lowered her voice with quiet respect. "Monroe," she said, "the board is waiting for your instruction." And behind the glass doors, the entire gala went silent. The hotel entrance fell silent after Maya Brooks spoke those 2 words to Monroe. Nobody moved, nobody even pretended not to hear it. Grace looked at Caleb first, confused, then shocked, then lost. The wind outside carried the sound of traffic from downtown Chicago. But near the entrance, everything felt frozen. "Daniel." Whitmore blinked hard. "Monroe," he repeated quietly. Nodded once. "Caleb Monroe, CEO of Monroe Capital Holdings." Vanessa's phone slowly lowered from her hand. Her face lost all color. One of the hotel staff whispered. The billionaire, another guest, immediately pulled out a phone and searched his name. Within seconds, screens lit up one after another. Photos appeared, magazine covers, interviews, Forbes headlines. Caleb stood there in the same cheap gray suit, same worn shoes, same tired eyes. But suddenly, the room looked at him differently, like his humanity had only become visible. After his bank account returned, Grace stared at him in silence. Whispered. Caleb looked at her gently. "My real name is Caleb." Behind the glass doors, people rushed toward the entrance, the same guests who ignored him. Minutes ago now tried to smile, tried to shake his hand, tried to fix their faces before cameras appeared. Daniel stepped forward quickly. "Mr. Monroe, I had no idea." Caleb looked at him calmly. "That's the problem." Daniel stopped speaking. Those 4 words hit harder than shouting ever could. Vanessa suddenly forced a nervous laugh. "Wow, this is actually insane. You were doing like a social experiment." Caleb's eyes moved toward her phone. "No, I was trying to remember what it felt like to be treated like a human being." Her smile disappeared immediately. Grace still had not moved. Her chest rose slowly with every breath. Caleb could see the hurt growing behind her eyes. Not anger, yet hurt first. That was worse. Then reporters began arriving. Somebody inside the gala had leaked the story already. Chicago media moved fast when money and scandal touched the same room cameras flashed near the sidewalk. "Mr. Monroe." Is it true you disguised yourself as homeless? As did this begin? After your broken engagement? Were you investigating social discrimination? Is this about Monroe Foundation's new housing initiative? Questions flew at him from every direction. Caleb ignored them all. He only looked at Grace. "Can we talk?" But before Grace could answer, Daniel tried again. "Mr. Monroe, perhaps we should continue this privately inside." Caleb turned slowly toward him. Inside, his voice stayed calm. "You mean the room your security just removed me from?" Daniel swallowed hard. Nobody rescued him this time. Not the donors. Not the cameras. Not even his political smile. Caleb stepped closer. "You spent 30 minutes talking about dignity tonight." Daniel said nothing. "Then you watched a man get humiliated because his suit looked cheap." The silence around them became painful. Grace lowered her eyes for a second because she realized something terrible in that moment. Caleb had not been exaggerating before he had truly lived through it. The stares, the disgust, the invisible wall between poor people and everyone else. And suddenly she remembered every time he stayed quiet while others judged him. Every small smile he forced. Every moment he pretended something did not hurt. Vanessa tried speaking again. "Look, people just misunderstood." Caleb cut her off softly. "They understood perfectly. That's why it matters." A camera flash exploded nearby. Maya leaned toward Caleb quietly. "Sir, the board members are waiting upstairs." Caleb nodded once, but his eyes never left Russ. "Give me a minute." Maya stepped back respectfully. Grace finally spoke very softly. How long Caleb's voice lowered too since before we met. She looked away immediately, like the answer physically hurt. "So all this time, Grace, I told you things." Her eyes watered now. "Real things, I know. And you let me believe you were homeless." Caleb struggled to answer because there was no clean explanation anymore. At first it had been an experiment. Then survival. Then fear. Then love. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said honestly. Grace gave a small, broken laugh. "Do you know what hurts the most?" Caleb stayed silent. "I was happy because I thought somebody finally understood my world." She looked directly at him now. "But you could leave that world anytime you wanted." Those words landed deep because they were true. Caleb had slept in cold streets by choice. Grace had known people trapped there. Without one, reporters still shouted questions nearby, but the emotional noise between them became louder than the crowd. Grace stepped backward slowly. "Was I another test?" Caleb's face tightened immediately. "No, then what was I?" he answered. Without hesitation. "The first person who made me forget why I started doing this." Grace's eyes filled completely then. And somehow that made things even sadder, because she believed him. But belief did not erase pain. Daniel quietly disappeared back inside the hotel. Vanessa stopped recording entirely. Nobody wanted attention anymore. Not after realizing they had revealed themselves instead. Caleb moved closer carefully. "Grace, please." But she shook her head. "I need time. I'll explain everything." "That's the problem," she whispered. "I don't even know which parts were real anymore." A cold wind passed between them. Grace pulled her coat tighter around herself. Caleb noticed she was still wearing the gloves she always carried in winter, the same kind she once gave him outside the church. That memory hurt now too. Grace looked at him one last time. Not with hatred, that would have been easier. She looked at him with disappointment, with grief, like she had opened a door to someone and suddenly found another stranger standing behind it. Then she turned and walked away down the sidewalk alone. Caleb watched her disappear into the Chicago night, while camera flashes kept exploding around him like distant lightning. And for the first time since this entire journey began, becoming visible again felt worse than being invisible. 3 days after the gala, Chicago would not stop talking about Caleb Monroe. Every news channel replayed the same footage, The billionaire in the cheap gray suit, the security guards blocking him at the entrance, the shocked faces when his assistant called him Mr. Monroe. Social media exploded with arguments. Some people praised him, others mocked him. Some called him brave. Others called him manipulative. But almost nobody talked about Grace Turner as a real person anymore. To the internet, she became the kind homeless girl, a symbol, a headline, a viral face attached to somebody else's story. And Grace hated it. Reporters waited outside her apartment building every morning. Cameras followed her to work. Strangers stopped her on sidewalks. Are you the girl from the Monroe story? Did you know he was rich? Are you two still together? One woman at a grocery store even asked for a selfie. Grace forced polite smiles at first, then exhaustion replaced politeness. One rainy afternoon, she pulled her hoodie tighter and rushed toward the church shelter, where she volunteered. But 2 reporters followed her again. Grace, do you forgive Caleb Monroe? Did he pay you to stay quiet? She suddenly stopped walking, please. Her voice cracked slightly. I'm not a story for a moment. Even the reporters looked uncomfortable inside the shelter kitchen. Grace leaned against the counter and closed her eyes. Father Ellis quietly handed her TVET outside. He asked gently. Grace laughed weakly. I miss being invisible. Father Ellis sat beside her slowly. Fame is strange. People stop seeing humans. They only see narratives. Grace stared into her cup. That's exactly what Caleb was trying to prove. Father Ellis nodded once, and maybe he proved it too well across the city. Caleb sat in a conference room surrounded by executives. Nobody discussed business anymore. They discussed damage control. Your approval ratings actually increased, one advisor explained, especially among younger demographics. Caleb looked disgusted. This isn't a campaign. Another executive leaned forward carefully. Sir. Monroe Foundation donations doubled this week. Caleb stood up immediately enough. The room fell silent. People are turning suffering into entertainment again. He grabbed his coat. Meetings over. But the hardest conversations waited at home. That evening, Caleb entered the Monroe family estate near Lakeshore Drive. The mansion felt colder than usual. His mother, Evelyn Monroe, sat near the fireplace with sharp posture and sharper eyes. His older brother, Marcus, stood beside the window, scrolling through headlines on a tablet. You embarrass this family, Marcus said immediately. Caleb removed his coat. Slowly, good evening to you too. Evelyn spoke calmly. That was worse. You disappeared for months, pretended to be homeless, humiliated yourself publicly. Caleb stared at her. I was trying to understand something real. Marcus scoffed. Poor people aren't a costume. Caleb, that line hit hard, because Caleb already knew it was partly true. Evelyn folded her hands carefully. And this girl, Caleb's face changed immediately. Huh? She is not prepared for this world. You don't even know her. Evelyn sighed softly. I know women like her become targets. Caleb stepped closer. She didn't ask for any of this exactly, Evelyn replied, which is why you should leave her alone now. That sentence stayed inside Caleb long after dinner ended, because for the first time, he feared his mother might be right. Not about Grace being unworthy, never that, but about the damage surrounding him. The pressure, the cameras, the endless judgment. Later that night, Caleb drove alone through South Side Chicago. No driver, no security. He parked near the church shelter where he first met Grace. Snow lightly covered the sidewalks now. Winter was getting worse. Through the window, he saw Grace organizing donated blankets, laughing softly with an elderly woman, looking tired. At the same time, Caleb stayed inside the car for nearly 10 minutes before finally walking in. Grace saw him immediately. Her smile disappeared. Father Ellis quietly walked away to give them privacy. Caleb spoke first. "You look exhausted." Grace crossed her arms gently. "You shouldn't be here. I needed to see you." Why her voice stayed calm. But sadness lived underneath every word to apologize again. Caleb shook his head slowly. "Oh." To listen, that surprised her a little. Caleb stepped closer carefully. "You were right." Grace looked away. What about all of it?" He swallowed hard. "I thought I could step into suffering and step back out whenever I wanted." Silence filled the room. "But people here don't get to do that." Grace finally looked at him again. Her eyes softened slightly. "But not enough, Caleb," he continued quietly. "I told myself I was searching for honesty, but I hurt someone honest in the process." Grace sat down slowly near the supply shelves. "Do you know what the worst part was? Caleb stayed standing listening when you were homeless. I admired you." Her eyes watered again. "I thought you were surviving despite everything life did to you." Caleb lowered his head. "Grace, but you always had a door back to safety." Those words hurt more this time, because Caleb finally understood them fully. Grace stood again. "You wanted to understand poor people." Her voice trembled now. "But poor people don't get an exit strategy." Caleb felt his chest tighten painfully. Grace continued softly. "You pretended to suffer to learn something, but the people around here wake up every day with suffering already waiting for them." Caleb could barely speak. "I know." Grace shook her head gently. "You're starting to know." Tears rolled down her face now, but her voice remained steady enough to destroy him completely. "You pretended to be poor, to see who loved you." She paused. "But poor people don't get to remove the costume when life becomes unbearable." Caleb closed his eyes briefly. Grace looked directly at him, then and delivered the truth that would stay with him forever. "You pretended to suffer to understand the poor, but poor people never get the chance to stop acting." The room fell silent again. Even the sounds from the kitchen disappeared for a moment. He realized then. This was no longer about love alone. It was about dignity, about humanity, about the difference between witnessing pain and living inside it. Grace wiped her eyes gently. "I don't hate you, Caleb. That somehow hurt even more, but you still have a lot to learn then." She walked quietly toward the back hallway, leaving Caleb standing alone beside shelves filled with donated blankets and canned soup. Finally understanding that guilt was not the same thing as growth. The cold wave hit Chicago harder than anyone expected. Temperatures dropped below zero for 4 straight nights. Wind slammed through streets like broken glass. Emergency shelters filled within hours. Churches opened basements. Schools handed out blankets. Ambulance sirens echoed through the city almost non-stop. And for the first time in years, Caleb Monroe stopped watching. Suffering from a distance, he worked quietly. No cameras, no interviews, no press statements. At 3 a.m, he helped unload donated heaters from trucks behind Father Ellis's church. By sunrise, he was carrying soup containers into crowded shelters, with frozen hands and aching shoulders. Nobody there cared. He was a billionaire. They cared whether there were enough beds left. Grace noticed him immediately the second night of the storm. Caleb stood near the kitchen doorway wearing 2 hoodies under a heavy coat. His expensive watches were gone. His security team was gone too. He looked exhausted, real exhausted. Grace watched him help an elderly man sit down before quietly mopping melted snow near the entrance. Father Ellis walked beside her slowly. "He's been here almost every night," the priest whispered. Grace stayed silent. "No reporters, no." Father Ellis added. "He refused media coverage." Grace looked toward Caleb again. He was laughing softly with a little boy while fixing a broken space heater. The laugh sounded tired. Human, not polished around midnight. The shelter reached full capacity. More people still waited outside in the freezing wind. Mothers holding children. Elderly men shaking from cold. Teenagers sleeping in train stations because they had nowhere else to go. Grace rubbed her forehead anxiously. "We're out of room." Caleb looked around immediately, opened the church offices already full. The storage basement too cold. Caleb thought fast, then grabbed his phone. "I know a building nearby." Within 40 minutes, buses arrived outside the shelter. Caleb had quietly opened one of Monroe Foundation's empty office buildings downtown as an emergency warming center. Portable beds were delivered overnight. Doctors volunteered food trucks arrived by morning. But Caleb never put his name on anything. He stayed carrying boxes beside everyone else. Grace noticed that too. Around 4 in the morning, chaos suddenly erupted near the entrance. A woman screamed for help. Grace ran first. Caleb followed instantly. A little boy, maybe 7 years old, struggled to breathe in his mother's arms. His lips looked pale blue asthma. The mother cried desperately. His inhaler's empty. The child wheezed violently. Panic spread fast. Snowstorms delayed ambulances across the city. "We can't wait," Grace said immediately. Caleb already grabbed his keys. "My truck's outside." Grace climbed into the passenger seat, while the terrified mother held her son in the back seat. Snow hammered the windshield, roads barely moved. Caleb drove through icy streets carefully but fast enough to matter. The little boy's breathing worsened every minute. Grace kept talking softly to him. "Stay with me, sweetheart." "Okay, look at me." Caleb gripped the steering wheel harder. Traffic lights blurred through snow. Then suddenly, everything stopped. Cars blocked the intersection ahead. Caleb cursed quietly under his breath. The boy gasped sharply again. Grace looked at Caleb. Fear filled her eyes. "Now we're losing time." Caleb didn't hesitate. He pulled off his coat, stepped into the storm, and ran toward the blocked traffic ahead. Snow covered him almost instantly. Grace watched through the windshield as Caleb knocked on windows, directed cars backward, and helped push a stranded vehicle out of the road with 2 strangers. Nobody there knew who he was. Nobody cared. They only saw a man trying to save a child. 10 freezing minutes later, they reached the emergency room. Doctors rushed the boy inside immediately. Grace sat in the waiting room shaking from cold and adrenaline. Caleb sat across from her, breathing heavily, snow still melting from his sleeves. Neither spoke at first. Then Grace looked at him carefully, really carefully. "Not as a billionaire, not as a social experiment. Just as a man you stayed," she said quietly. Caleb looked confused. "Of course I stayed." Grace swallowed hard. "You could have called someone else. Paid." "Someone else?" "Sent staff." Caleb leaned back tiredly. "That little boy didn't need my money tonight." His voice cracked slightly. "He needed me." Silence filled the room softly after that. Not awkward silence. Honest silence. Grace stared at him for a long moment before speaking again. "You're different now." Caleb looked down slowly. "I hope so." Grace's eyes watered slightly. "Before part of you wanted answers." She paused. "Now, you just want to help." Caleb finally admitted the truth he avoided for months. "Because now I understand something." Grace waited quietly. Caleb looked toward the hospital hallway. Dignity matters more than charity. Grace felt something inside her finally soften. Not because Caleb was rich, not because he suffered, but because he changed. Without asking anyone to applaud him for it, a doctor finally approached them near sunrise. "He's stable now." The mother burst into tears of relief. Grace covered her face briefly. Caleb closed his eyes and exhaled deeply. For the first time all night, weeks later, when winter finally loosened its grip on Chicago, Caleb and Grace stood together inside the small church where they first met. No giant ballroom, no television cameras, no celebrity guests, just warm lights, soft music, and Father Ellis smiling proudly near the altar. Grace wore a simple ivory dress. Caleb wore a dark suit, with no luxury watch on his wrist. During the ceremony, Grace quietly laughed when Caleb nervously forgot. "Part of his vows you faced billion-dollar negotiations easier than this," she whispered. Caleb smiled softly. "This matters more." After the wedding, snow began falling gently outside the church windows. Again, Caleb reached into his coat pocket and carefully pulled out the old wool gloves Grace gave him that first freezing night he had kept them the entire time, worn out now, slightly torn near the fingertips. Grace looked emotional immediately. "You still kept them?" Caleb nodded once. "They reminded me what kindness feels like when nobody's watching." Grace squeezed his hand softly, and for the first time in years, Caleb Monroe no longer wondered whether somebody could love him without his money. Because standing beside Grace in that tiny church, he finally understood that real love begins the moment people stop trying to measure human worth at all. Sometimes the people carrying the deepest pain are the ones the world refuses to see. Caleb Monroe spent years surrounded by wealth, yet he still felt unloved. But when he lost the image of power, he finally saw how invisible struggling people become every single day. This story is not really about a billionaire pretending to be poor. It is about dignity, about how small acts of kindness can keep a hurting person alive a little longer. Grace never treated Caleb like a project, a joke, or a headline. She treated him like a human being, and that changed him more than money ever could. Real love does not look at clothes status or social class. First, real love sees the person underneath the pain. Maybe that is the lesson people do not always need. Saving sometimes, they only need respect. A warm meal, a gentle word. Someone willing to look them in the eye and remind them they still matter.